This is the Voice of America, Washington, D.C., signing on.
अनुकूल वातावरण की आवश्यकता है.
Las temperaturas en otras ciudades de los Estados.
The Voice of America. It is the official radio link between the United States and the rest of the world. Each day, 3,000 people work to put out the news in more than 40 languages. They aim to live up to the Voice of America Charter, which states that their broadcasts must be accurate, objective, and comprehensive. They struggle against deadlines. They struggle to clarify the chaos of the world. And they struggle against pressures to write a story in a certain way. The people of The Voice do not always live up to the perfection of the Charter, but they always try. This is the story of their 50-year struggle to get it straight. In September of the year 1939, Europe burst into flames after Adolf Hitler's troops and planes attacked Poland to ignite the Second World War. It was the infamous Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. From Germany, a war of words also blasted out to the radio sets of the world. Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels were perfecting the greatest propaganda machine in history, broadcasting to the world that the Germans were winning, the Third Reich would inevitably triumph, and the Nazis would prevail for 1,000 years. For more than 2 years, the American people remained deeply divided about whether or not to enter the war. There was no official American international broadcasting to counter the blitzkrieg of German ideas and boasts. And Americans were uneasy about the very idea of a government-controlled propaganda radio station. But President Roosevelt had something else in mind, an official American station that would simply tell the news to the people of Europe. Set up on New York City's Madison Avenue only 2 months after Pearl Harbor, it would be called the Voice of America. The staff kept the station on the air 24 hours a day, broadcasting in English, German, French, and Italian. There was one studio and one transmitter. Pioneer broadcaster Walter Roberts remembers the actual words broadcast to the listeners by the first announcer on the very first broadcast. It was February 24th, 1942.
You will, from now on, hear the Voice of America every day. We are going to bring you the good news and the bad news. We will not hide anything from you. We are going to bring you many voices from America. Many voices from America. Stimmen aus Amerika.
One of the president's speechwriters was the famous playwright Robert E. Sherwood. It was he who brought producer John Houseman from Hollywood to take over the new organization. Houseman's strong point was drama, not news, and those early voice programs would be dramatic indeed.
There were always 4 voices on Voice of America. And those 4 voices, he broke up the sound. No one spoke for very long. So that the first announcer would say, this is the Voice of America.
The United States of America calling the people of Europe. Every morning at this same time, we bring you the news, good or bad. American news as it comes to us from every part of our own country.
Nothing was more than a couple of sentences long. Everything was dramatized. Everything was high-pitched, dramatic, and urgent.
He was the one, particularly, who gave the staff a sense of purpose. It was partly the abilities of a great theatrical producer with regard to his cast.
The United States of America calling the people of France. L'Amérique vous parle.
The Voice's difficult task was to tell a captive people that Americans were deeply concerned, yet at the same time not raise unrealistic hopes for an early liberation.
Our objective was to shore up their will, their confidence, and to tell them of our determination to stay on their side and to be absolutely sure that they will be liberated.
From the White House, President Roosevelt made history with a momentous announcement, assuring Frenchmen that America is fighting their enemy. His message in French was broadcast by shortwave.
Nous arrivons parmi vous seulement pour écraser et pour anéantir vos ennemis. Croyez-nous bien, nous ne voulons vous faire aucun mal. Rendez-vous concours où vous pouvez, mes amis, et nous verrons revenir le jour glorieux quand la liberté et la paix régneront de nouveau dans le monde. Vive la France éternelle!
The news in the first half of 1942 was all bad, and Haussmann saw the challenge clearly. He put it this way.
As Japanese victories and invasions followed one another with sickening regularity, and the Nazi armies moved ever deeper into Russia and the Near East, we would have to report our reverses without weaseling.
Then in June of 1942 came the first Allied victory in the far Pacific.
It was the Battle of Midway, you know. I was a supervisor on the night shift, and both the engineer and I, his name was Jerry Brush, we fell asleep during the show. And the record, you know, the disc on aluminum base, and the disc got caught in one groove. We gave them the whole story of the Battle of Midway, Admiral Chester Nimitz with a huge victory, and then in one groove, the record got stuck. Centi due velivoli sono stati abbattuti. Centi due velivoli sono stati abbattuti. Centi due. This went on for 50 times. And finally, the Navy censor was talking, Borgida, what the hell is going on? You just sank the Japanese Navy 50 times. We didn't realize it. And then we just moved the groove, you know, and we were very sheepish about it. But he said, as long as it is a victory, it's okay.
The arsenal of democracy. It was Robert E. Sherwood who coined the phrase and Roosevelt who spoke it. America would help to win the war by becoming the great arsenal of democracy. The theme was constantly repeated on The Voice.
In every war plant and in every home. Today, every American on the home front is a soldier of production.
Then on November 8th, 1942, the Allies landed in North Africa. It was America's first victory against the Germans. Finally, the Voice of America could report concrete military progress.
We knew that there was a lot of listening in the top leadership headquarters. We also knew that there was a lot of listening by perfectly ordinary people. Through monitoring, through listening to what they were saying, that they were countering the things that we were saying. And that if they didn't think that a lot of people were listening, they wouldn't have bothered to do that.
June 6th, 1944, was one of the pivotal days of the war and of history, too. 150,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy to take back a Europe that had been destroyed by the Nazis. By this time, we had created an information machine as effective as our war machine. Robert Bauer, a dedicated young broadcaster, was one of those who fought with the spoken word. He remembers how it was on D-Day in the studio.
We had to broadcast, but we were thinking continuously of those fellows who had to do the fighting, you know? So at that moment, you don't feel terribly proud of yourself. You feel a little bit humble, you know, because you sort of, you know, you sit there in a nice little studio, they're broadcasting, you know, and others are doing the fighting.
The Voice's message was getting through, confidently offering hope. On this day, expectations were being replaced with reality. The nieces of the great Czechoslovak patriot Jan Masaryk were among the millions of listeners who were thrilled by the news.
That was the day we were waiting for, because that meant coming to Europe and defeating Nazis. We were happy, yes, and yes.
Do you remember Charlotta? Charlotta was quite small, the daughter of Herberta, and she was jumping and crying, and she said, "Invasion, invasion, invasion, invasion." So it was.
Yes.
Yes.
Everybody was so happy then. And all this we got through Voice of America, all this news.
In August of 1944, the Voice sang out the news that Paris was free, and in a few months all of France would be free. But World War II was a long way from over, and many would die before it was, including the Commander-in-Chief. On April 12, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt collapsed and died. He had been president for so long, 12 years, that it seemed forever. The nation mourned. Grief was everywhere. Americans could scarcely remember another president. And now the Voice had two difficult jobs to do: to explain to the world the process by which a vice president is elevated to president, and to reassure the world that the new president, Harry S. Truman, a little-known senator from Missouri, would successfully continue Roosevelt's work. Then on May 8th, the war in Europe was over, as the Germans surrendered. And the surrender of Japan on August 14th brought to a close the greatest conflict in history.
On behalf of all the nations at war with Japan.
This is Vincent Alexander speaking to you from Times Square in the heart of New York. Less than 1 hour
By the closing of the war, the Voice had really reached a high point as far as programming, number of people, facilities, very heady days. Lots of things were happening, and suddenly the war ends. And you've got the Voice up here, and literally what happened at that point was a collapse. And it was, I guess, natural with our American frame of mind that we had to dismantle the Voice as well as bring home all the tanks and bring home all the boys. And so literally, the Voice went through a disastrous period of time.
The Soviet Union, however, was now in control of all Eastern Europe. And when the Russians tried to grab Greece, Harry Truman took a stand and another war suddenly loomed. But this war would be a cold one, and a long one, too. And the value of the Voice would once again become quite clear.
Men led by communists.
And the Voice began to become more strident in its own programming, more hard-hitting in its own programming, directed toward the Soviet Union.
And so we worked for weeks and weeks until the actual broadcast, the first broadcast, which took place in February, end of February 1947. And there were 5 people altogether in the studio. I was among them. And of course, it was very exciting to think, and we were told that millions of people would be listening.
That was so long ago, I hardly remember the content, but I remember the general impression was positive. They gave some very impartial news, and then they gave a commentary that anyone would sign his name to, I mean, dealing with current affairs of that period.
In 1950, President Truman felt the need for a strong psychological offensive to answer what he termed the communist big lie.
Your Voice of America, New York hit.
Though radio broadcasting is important in our information program to the free world, it is crucial in our efforts to reach the peoples held captive by the communists. It's the only means we have for penetrating the Iron Curtain. And that's why over 70% of Voice of America broadcasts are beamed to audiences in communist-held areas.
We were still broadcasting the truth, but we began to rub in things in some of those languages. But so did they. So did they. I listened to some of the Russian programs, they were horrendous.
It was nothing but a war of words on both sides. We used to try to sell our system and our foreign policy to the West. The West would tell us what we were worth, the things that were wrong with our system. We would hear about the failure, say, of the collective farm system, the Russian expansionism, not only in Eastern Europe, but say in other parts of the world, in the third world countries, that sort of thing. We, of course, try to counter all these things and explain it away through the prism of our ideology, that is the ideology of Marxism-Leninism.
Just the titles of the programs themselves tell you what was happening. For example, a program titled Political Cabaret, in which we expose the weaknesses and evils of the imperialist communist. The Life Behind the Iron Curtain and the Communist Paradise programs that expose the hypocrisy of the communist big lie.
And forbidden fruit's always sweet, you know. And people would tune in and they would whisper, say, did you hear it last night? You know, that sort of thing. But then when the jamming began in the big cities, it was almost impossible to listen to any Russian language station.
Jamming done by placing a transmitter, a similar transmitter as the Voice of America was using to broadcast music and news, etc., on the same frequency as the Voice of America, and putting on, instead of sound and music, very irritating noises that would tend to drive you away from listening to the program, because if you try to listen, it will have a physical effect upon you.
By the early 50s, the Cold War had produced a nightmare at home. A powerful anti-communist senator from Wisconsin was investigating the work and the lives of many Voice officials. He was Senator Joseph McCarthy.
Mr. Merrigan's endorsement, I'd like to request that the committee now take action and ask the Justice Department to return an indictment against Mr. Merrigan for perjury. This will serve...
Senator McCarthy wanted to destroy the American communists he was convinced had infiltrated the Voice of America. He ended up by destroying careers.
At best, Senator Joseph McCarthy was unethical in what he did and the approach that he did. What he constantly was hammering at was the whole idea that the Voice was soft on communism, that there was a communist plot behind what was going on in the Voice of America.
So I suddenly found out that I had been accused of participating in toning down the anti-communist content of a program and or wasting government money. The program in question was called Eye of the Eagle.
On March 5th, McCarthy summoned VOA producer and broadcaster Robert Bauer to appear before his Senate subcommittee in Washington.
I slowly demolished the accusation. I finally said I would like to read some of the excerpts of that famous program, Eye of the Eagle. So they permitted me to do that. And when I read it, in the audience there was laughter, because the whole thing was so blatantly anti-communist that it was almost silly, you know.
I would add that as a result of the McCarthy investigations, there were 2 suicides within the Voice of America, which is a tragic thing.
With the death of Joseph Stalin and the end of the Korean War, President Eisenhower had an opportunity to further ease the tensions of the Cold War. Though trained as a military man, Eisenhower had long understood the value of international communications. Ike's voice was heard frequently on the VOA.
Into the light, to find a way by which the minds of men, the hopes of men, the souls of men everywhere can move forward toward peace and happiness.
Under the Eisenhower administration, the VOA headquarters were shifted from New York to Washington, D.C., and the Voice became a part of the new United States Information Agency. In a time of lessening tension between the United States and the USSR, the Voice began exploring creative routes to a larger Russian audience. Perhaps the most remarkable programming innovation was the introduction of jazz in a program called Music USA.
We're criticized heavily for being frivolous, for wasting taxpayers' money on broadcasting jazz around the world. Well, the operation stood firm and insisted that this was a very attractive program, that it would draw listeners.
Willis Conover speaking. This is the Voice of America Jazz Hour. The music of jazz parallels the freedom that we have in America, something that not every country has.
Естественно,
поначалу знание всех ваших звезд пришло от Уилласа Хановера, но звезд ваших мы знаем практически всех. То есть я там услышал впервые Эрл Гарнера, Оскара Питерсона, Дэйва Брубага, Джорджа Ширинга, Телониуса Монка, то есть практически всех.
И очень трудно было мальчишке 15 лет дождаться этой передачи. И мама была очень недовольна, что я слушал эту передачу и говорила: сынок, не слушай ты этот «Голос Америки», то тебя посадят.
Одним из пунктов обвинительного заключения моего было слушание «Голоса Америки» радиостанции и пропаганда. Вот. Чем я подтачивал, так сказать, основы советской власти.
Вот. Не слушая их уже музыку, мне захотелось сыграть на контрабасе. И я, в общем-то, рад, что моя мечта осуществилась. И вот я очень благодарен этой передаче. Очень благодарен. Спасибо ей. Большое спасибо.
The tensions between East and West fluctuated over the years, and they intensified during the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. But it was a fight the Hungarians could not win. They could not defeat an army of 250,000 Russian soldiers. As the Voice of America reported these events, there were charges by some that voice broadcasts raise false expectations in Hungary, expectations that America was coming to their support. The crisis proved difficult for the Voice to cover.
The test to us was to decide what was accurate, what was not, to broadcast developments, yet at the same time not incite any further opposition that would lead to loss of life.
It wasn't something that you could call inciting. It was full reporting. We didn't tell them, hey, Hungarians, get on the barricades. And we just tell them the whole world is watching your courageous fight, stuff like that. Well, for a patriot, that's a big deal. The whole world is watching your courageous fight. The people of the United States and other people worldwide are watching your courageous resistance to the Russians. And they kept resisting until they were mowed down. But it wasn't the Voice of America guff.
In the year 1960, President Eisenhower, who had been a father figure president for 8 years, would be succeeded by the youngest man ever to be elected to the office, John F. Kennedy. Shortly after his inauguration, the new president spoke at the 20th birthday party of The Voice. He was introduced by Edward R. Murrow, whom he had appointed to head the United States Information Agency.
You are obliged to tell our story in a truthful way, to tell Oliver Cromwell said about his portrait, to paint us with all our blemishes and warts, all the things about us that may not be so immediately attractive. We compete with other...
A few months before, a fiasco in Cuba had revealed the United States with even more warts and blemishes than the president had in mind. In April of 1961, a paramilitary group of Cubans under the secret sponsorship of the CIA had landed on the south shore of Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs. Their aim was to retake the island from Fidel Castro.
It was more than a disaster for a covert action by the intelligence agencies of the United States. It was a diplomatic disaster.
I was driving into work, listening to the CBS morning news when I heard about it. And I flipped, as everybody else did when they first heard about it. So I speeded up, went through red lights, and got to the Voice as fast as I could. Found that no one had done anything yet. I called Ed Murrow, and he was spitting mad because no one had told him either. And that's when he made his famous statement. He said, they expect us to be in at the crash landings. We better be at the takeoff. So I told him what I planned to do, and he said, fine, go ahead. And we went to 24-hour broadcasts in Spanish. Now, the problem was, in addition to our broadcast, and we had great trouble finding out what was going on and being told the truth about what was going on within the government, But CIA had a transmitter on Swan Island in the Caribbean, and it was transmitting into Cuba in Spanish a very different story, that the landing was successful and everything was going fine.
Voice, on the other hand, carried information contradicting those statements. And that really didn't sit well with the policy office. These folks kept saying, well, balance, balance, let's balance. Let's get a balanced account. Balance. Well, what is the balance when the events turn bad from the point of view of the policy and the State Department?
So you had total confusion from a Cuban point of view, from a person listening in Cuba, what's going on? And everybody wanted to be on the winning side, but the question was, which was the winning side? And naturally, the people did not rise as had been hoped with the landing, and it was a dismal failure.
October 1962, another major conflict with the communists. This was the controversy over the placing of Russian missile bases in Cuba, only 90 miles from the United States. This time, the Voice was able to work effectively because the CIA was not broadcasting a contrary story.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Our job was to tell the Latin American people about the safety of the area and also the arrangements, the negotiations that were between President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
And when the Russian freighters finally turned around, the Voice could announce that the great international crisis was suddenly over. It had been a century since the Emancipation Proclamation, but in 1963, the country seemed ready to actually do something about civil rights. The civil rights movement, as told worldwide by the Voice, was inspirational news, particularly to its third world audience.
Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
And of course, as it turned out to be a turning point in the civil rights struggle in the United States, it was fortuitous in the site so that we were able to report it in that kind of detail. And it's a bright page, I think, in VOA's history.
In the national confusion after President Kennedy's death in Dallas in November of 1963, Alex Cleforth remained on duty in the VOA headquarters in Washington. He recalls the chaos of those sad and anxious hours.
We were on an open line with Dallas, Texas. I was in direct contact with the White House, with the State Department. But I couldn't get a single official to make the public declaration that the President of the United States had died. So I then said, who will do it? And they said, you do it. It was personally a very emotional thing. I felt as if I had killed President Kennedy, because up to that moment I didn't want to believe that he was dead. But now I had to announce, and thereby to the world, that our beloved president was dead.
La procesión fúnebre avanza lentamente por la avenida Pennsylvania.
His funeral, I was one of 3 announcers describing the funeral here in Washington. And many stations in Latin America, TV stations, use the image from networks, but they were using the sound of the Voice of America.
En el cementerio vemos, entre otros dignatarios, al presidente de Francia, Charles de Gaulle, y al emperador de Etiopía, Haile Selassie.
72 hours before, with Air Force One parked on the tarmac at the Dallas airport, Lyndon Baines Johnson had become President of the United States. civil rights and the war on poverty were his great dreams, but Vietnam became his reality.
The Voice of America was sucked into the morass of the war in Vietnam, much as America was. It was in every part something that got more and more consuming. It had the difficulty of reporting a number of events which were not in consonance with the view of those events in official Washington.
I'm sure the president must have known it wasn't working well. I guess maybe he didn't know what to do, how to stop it.
We cannot be defeated by force of arms.
He was a proud man. He had been a success all his life. He didn't want to quit when he hadn't won, but he was getting in deeper and deeper, domestically and overseas. And he was talking to a friend, and he was furious at the domestic networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC, the way they had covered that particular incident. And he turned to his friend and he said, I know I can't affect the broadcast companies. I know they won't listen to me. I know they won't help me. But God damn it, I have my own radio. I've got to make that do it right. Of course, he was talking about the voice. So that increasingly, first imperceptibly, there was more and more pressure from the White House on the agency, and more pressure from the agency onto the voice to change a word there, to tone down another word there, add a word of praise in here, to change the normal and, in our judgment, correct, objective way of doing our job.
The professional skill of the VOA, in the broadest sense, was honed by those terrible events in Southeast Asia. It also was perhaps the reason that the VOA Charter was made law. Because in the series of reporting these events, diplomats in Southeast Asia subjected the VOA to an assault and battery that was close to the worst over an extended period of time that I knew about. And it engaged in so many such events that the circumstances of these events became known to the Congress. And at that point, the VOA Charter, which was then an administrative document, took form as a law and a requirement. That the VOA is mandated and required to be accurate, objective, and comprehensive. And this is a requirement that is very important to remember, because while violation of that law carries no direct penalty, conspiracy to violate the law does.
I was a Washington correspondent. I was, in fact, the NBC White House correspondent in 1965 when President Johnson suddenly, and to me inexplicably, became my best friend in Washington. I never saw anybody like that in my life. He really gave me the treatment. My wife and I up at Camp David, my wife and I and the kids on the yacht, and I thought he liked me. What he was really doing, he wanted to hire me. I held out for about 10 days. And he called me one day in the press room at the White House, and he said, John, I have to have an answer on this. And I said, listen, Mr. President, this is the biggest decision I'm probably going to have to make in my life. It involves my children, my future, my career, my life. I said, I've got to have more time to think about it. And he said, well, you're right. I'll just hold on the phone here while you think.
John Chancellor's programming reflected the diversity of the 60s and the occasional eccentricities of an expanding international staff.
It was a kind of a madhouse in the best possible sense of that word, because they were all people of considerable accomplishment in their own countries, except for the young ones we were bringing in, and they had a lot of vanity. And how dare you say that to me? Don't you realize who I am, young man? I had that from all kinds of people who were working for me, in Balkan languages, in Asian languages. And if you recruit the best ones, if you recruit the ones whose names, whose reputations, whose intellectual skills mean something in your target audience, then you're going to have a place full of zanies. And you just have to live with it. And that was the toughest lesson I had to learn. But it was antic, it was mad.
In the spring of 1968, the Czechoslovak government set out on a path leading to greater freedom, under the impression that the Russians would allow them to conduct their internal affairs with greater latitude. They felt that they were on the way toward what they called socialism with a human face. It was the Prague Spring, and Alexander Dubček was the leader of the movement. As democracy bloomed tentatively behind the Iron Curtain, the Voice carried the details to the world.
Tak z tohoto hľadiska, podľa môjho názoru, i v tom období 68. roku Hlas Ameriky a všetci tí, ktorí v jeho službách boli, z tohoto hľadiska boli veľkou morálnou podporou pre nás a pre praktickú informáciu k našim občanom, ani nie tak k našim, lebo títo na svojej koži pociťovali, ale pre svet, pre mobilizáciu svetovej verejnej mienky bola to nesmierna veľká podpora.
But as it turned out, the men in the Kremlin were not really ready for socialism with a human face, and they sent their tanks to prove it.
«Голосу Америки» нам не надо было объяснять, хорошо это или плохо, что вошли наши войска. Несмотря на то, что газеты наши писали, какой героический подвиг совершается. Но нам надо было знать, что там происходит. На какой стадии, где идут выстрелы. Как на это откликнулся чешский народ.
The Voice broadcast this unhappy turn of events directly back into Czechoslovakia, as well as to the rest of the world. Alexander Dubček was arrested. In earlier years, he probably would have been executed.
Ak sa v tom svete skutočne niečo dialo, tak i zásluhou Hlasu Ameriky, preto lebo prostredníctvom Hlasu Ameriky svet sa dozvedal, čo sa v Československu stalo. A tým celá demokratická Európa, demokratický svet zdvihol svoj hlas na morálnu podporu nášho tohoto hnutia. A preto možno, že vďačím tomu, že dnes som tu v tejto besede s vami.
The end of the decade was marked by a significant American achievement, both scientific and political. Blasting off from Florida, American astronauts landed on the moon.
That immense audience for the Voice of America built up to what was estimated to be over 500 million people around the world tuned in to VOA commentators describing the lunar landing. That was a huge event for the Voice of America. Of course, it was for all mankind, too, as Neil Armstrong later said.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Do you know the Brezhnev joke about the cosmonauts? Well, here goes. When the United States landed its Apollo craft on the moon, one small step for man, one big leap for mankind, remember the words? Well, Brezhnev got all the cosmonauts together and he says, he had a very stiff upper lip, spoke like this, he says, "Comrades, the Americans have landed on the moon. They've beaten us to it. We've got to prove that we are superior. Our government has decided that you will land on the sun. But Comrade Brezhnev, the craft will burn up at the distant approaches to the sun." Listening to you, one might think we have only fools in our government. You will fly at night.
By May of 1972, there was a new word to describe the relationship between the superpowers: détente. The Nixon-Brezhnev summit agreement in Moscow emphasized détente, but détente was only intermittent. The old antagonisms remained, and the voice was trapped in the duality of the American policy.
And VOA was caught in this whole process. One day it was anti-communist, and the next day it was supposed to love the Russians, love the communists.
And another word now came into the relationship between the superpowers: dissident. The VOA was sending back into Russia a flow of news about Soviet dissidents, both the dissidents who had left the country and those who had remained.
Но голос давал нам понимание и о нас самих, и о людях в нашей стране. А через голос мы узнавали людей, которые потом становились нашими лидерами. Мы узнавали Сахарова, мы узнавали Солженицына, мы узнавали интервью Сахарова. Если нам говорили, что Пастернак предал нашу родину, там, получив Нобелевскую премию, мы знали, что через голос мы знали, что это не так. Мы все понимали, мы имели другой взгляд на одно и то же событие.
The Voice reported on Mr. Nixon's successes in China and also on the Nixon debacle that was called Watergate.
Now, Watergate was a difficult story for VOA to cover, not because of pressure, not because of pressure from the administration, but explaining American institutions, explaining an American president under fire, why you have to go into a great deal of explanatory material.
Yet the Watergate story was actually pretty simple. President Nixon had covered up a burglary and a conspiracy.
They carried electronic equipment for tapping telephones, and it was obvious that they were there on a mission.
The Voice, however, had to reveal its source for every story, and in the miasma of Watergate, this was difficult.
Well, the way we got around that was I would go to Deputy Press Secretary Jerry Warren, because he was in the lower press office at the White House, and I'd ask him for comment on the latest revelation, and he'd say, I just can't comment, Phil. So then we would say, the White House has declined comment on a report that.
In August of 1974, after the resignation of Mr. Nixon under the threat of impeachment by the American Congress, the Voice reported the swearing-in of Gerald Ford, our only non-elected president.
If there's one thing that people at the Voice of America are accustomed to, it's changes in administration. I remember talking to some of my colleagues about the change between the Nixon-Ford era and the coming of the Carter era. Many of them recalling the Nixon-Ford period as a time of really great excitement. The president coming in with a pledge to end the war in Vietnam, the president coming in with new initiatives for China, of a number of things which were very exciting for an international broadcasting organization to cover. I think there was a bit of a fear at the advent of the Carter administration that this was a domestic president and maybe all of the emphasis would be on the domestic issues of interest to a plain decent farmer from Plains, Georgia.
But as it turned out, the most memorable achievement of the Carter years reported by The Voice was the pioneering Camp David Agreement. For the first time, an Arab and an Israeli sat down at the same table to try to solve the old intractable problems of the Middle East.
Perhaps the most dramatic event in that time frame was the hostage crisis in Iran, where the American embassy was invaded and the American staff at that embassy was taken hostage.
You could never forget that Americans were being held against their will. You could never forget this sort of great indignity which had been brought to America and to her official representatives overseas. There was a great deal of anger, there was a great deal of concern, confusion. But throughout it all, the people at the Voice of America covered the story.
The following program is in Persian.
برنامه فارسی صدای آمریکا. We're trying to inform the Iranian audiences about what is happening in the world in the first place and what is the reaction, the world reaction, the American reaction to the holding of the hostages. And thirdly, we want to inform the Iranian public that in this particular instance, every evidence shows that the American public is behind the president on this.
And of course, they were finally freed dramatically at the time of the inauguration of President Reagan. And this was very interesting as an event, in that the Voice of America had at the site of the inauguration 9 language services covering the inauguration live. At the very same moment, in Iran itself, we had a very courageous stringer who was at the airport on a telephone hooked to our newsroom, in which she described the liftoff of the plane that freed those hostages. It was perhaps the first report, certainly the first live report from Tehran, that in fact wheels were up and the hostages were on their way to freedom.
At the beginning of the 1980s, Moscow was described by President Reagan as the heart of an evil empire. And since the Russians had shot down a KAL airliner and had invaded Afghanistan, it seemed as though the old Cold War of words would go on forever.
We had the opportunity in these years, by sharpening the journalistic focus of VOA on what was really happening in the world, we had the opportunity of becoming more relevant to our audiences in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union.
It's amazing if you think about the amount of effort, money, time that they put in to keep people from getting information from the West. They ringed every city in the Soviet Union of more than 200,000 people with jamming transmitters, skywave transmitters, ground wave transmitters. And we in turn got better and more sophisticated all the time in getting our signal and our messages and our information into the people of the USSR.
But the jamming and the gridlock did not go on forever. By the time Air Force One arrived in Moscow in May of 1988, Mr. Reagan had perceived that Mr. Gorbachev's idea of glasnost might actually have the promise of something new. And by then, the first VOA bureau had been established in the historic capital city.
The picture that stands out in my mind is President Reagan's walk on Red Square with Gorbachev basically just hand in hand. Here's a President Reagan who a couple of years ago called it the evil empire. And here he was basically chatting with the president of the Soviet Union. That, I think, for me and for all of the Western correspondents, set the tone to not only that summit, but to the relationship that was evolving over the years to come.
And when George Bush came into office the following year, the Voice was still broadcasting to places where some regimes didn't want it to be heard.
We take free news broadcasts for granted in America. But some people risked death to hear the truth.
And in China, in Tiananmen Square, that is precisely what happened.
I was assigned to cover the 1989 summit, Sino-Soviet summit between Chinese leaders and Mr. Gorbachev. However, when I arrived in Beijing, I realized that the story has changed from the summit to that of the student demonstration.
It was like a scene from the film Reds. Outside my bedroom window, again, literally, looking out at the main boulevard leading to Tiananmen Square, trucks filled with students with red banners and flags with slogans on them and going at high speed and flapping in the wind and people cheering and singing. And it was an amazing scene.
The square was huge, but the students fill up the huge square, and they come in hundreds and hundreds, just hordes of them. We want to get to the students. I said, I'm a reporter from the Voice of America. As soon as they heard this, their attitude changed 180 degrees. They yelled to their friends and said, hey, here are the VOA reporters. They want to interview the students at the center.
And you see from TV that, CBS camera crew was cut off, the Dun Brothers cable line was cut off. And then VOA again becomes the only source, and BBC from the outside world. So that's the only source people listen. It become more crucial after the massacre the massacre night, because the whole nation was stunned by what happened in Beijing. They didn't know exactly what happened, because the government saying no gunshot, no people died, just a peaceful, takeover. But that was not true. But what is true? You can find it from VOA.
Anyone who stood up or who the soldiers saw moving was shot.
After the massacre, which was the night of the 3rd leading onto the 4th of June, there began a real campaign of propaganda against VOA by the official Chinese media.
After reporting on China for 2 years, the Voice's Beijing bureau chief was ordered out of the country. The Chinese government accused Mr. Pessin of spreading rumors and instigating counter-revolutionary turmoil. He was described as spreading the plague of reaction all over Tiananmen Square. But Pessin wasn't backing down.
The government accused me of inciting turmoil and counter-revolutionary rebellion. That's not what I do. What I do is report the news.
The Chinese government was frozen in the past, but in Eastern Europe at the same time, a vast, unprecedented political thaw was underway. And the Voice was reporting this great cascade of change.
I think what happened in 1989 in Eastern Europe can be explained in considerable part by the effects of Western broadcasting, both television and radio. And I compare it to a kind of wildfire effect.
They were helping Lech Wałęsa in Poland find out what Václav Havel was doing in Czechoslovakia, and we're helping Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia finding out what Bulgarian dissidents were doing at the time, or Hungarian dissidents for that matter.
And then the Berlin Wall got knocked down and nobody sent any troops to prop it up. That did it. That was history's turning point.
The fact that I was alone for VOA in East Berlin made it extremely difficult for me. There were huge crowds of people, a lot of sound, a lot of singing, cheering, people, thousands of people crossing over to West Berlin. It was one of the most moving scenes that I ever saw in my life.
When the Voice brought the news of the Berlin Wall to the people of Prague, they could not be held back any longer.
I got a hold of a tape recording of the police conversations during this demonstration. Orders being given to flatten those people in front of the theater, to detain journalists, to isolate people who were being detained.
We would never even think that within 10 days we will rule this country and that the communist regime will collapse.
I recorded the chants of Dubček, Havel, and freedom, and we want democracy.
And Václav Havel was freely elected president of Czechoslovakia. Yet in Moscow, there would be one last attempt to keep the ancient status quo.
On a Monday morning, August 18, we woke up to the news that a self-proclaimed committee of 8 men had seized power in the Soviet Union and deposed President Gorbachev. We began reporting the news shortly after TASS announced that the committee had taken power. The Voice of America Russian service went on the air 24 hours a day, around the clock during the days of the coup, so that events in the country about the progress of the coup and therefore the collapse of the coup were being broadcast to millions of Soviet citizens around the country who had little idea of what was really going on in Moscow or Leningrad or Kiev.
Значит, что происходило? С балкона Белого дома говорили депутаты, а у всех в руках были транзисторные приемники. Одним ухом мы слушали, что говорит с балкона депутат, А другим ухом мы слушали, что говорит «Голос Америки».
Within hours, Mr. Yeltsin reported that President Gorbachev had been liberated. The coup had collapsed. But there was more to it than that. The entire Soviet empire had crumbled.
We didn't know what will come out of it. We didn't know what will come instead of communist regime. We just wanted to have the change. And in this, the growing amount of information given to our public through Voice of America and other foreign broadcasting stations was just crucial.
They did not know what would come out of it. All they knew was that they wanted the change. Because the political and social crises of the world will inevitably continue, the Voice of America will continue to play the role that it has played for half a century. And the pressures that have propelled the Voice, they will continue too. Pressures from single-minded, powerful people. Pressures from newly empowered groups and governments. Pressures from a worldwide spectrum of differing societal values. And the people of the Voice will be successful only as their listeners everywhere perceive that they have been broadcasting things that turn out to be facts out in the living world.
And you know, at the beginning, we were not even settled on the name, whether it's... A lot of people wanted to call it the Voices of America in Spanish, the Voices of America in Indonesia, or the Voice... Elmer Davis said no. I was there at the meeting. He said, it will be called the Voice of America. Just one. Not the voices, just one. And it worked.
The United States of America calling the people of Europe.
Every morning at this same time...
Our own position has been clear from the start. We have looked upon Laval as the betrayer.
Today, every American on the home front is a soldier of production.
Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces began landing Allied armies this morning.
Less than 1 hour ago, the momentous news that Japan had accepted the surrender terms of the Allies.
Слушайте, говорит Нью-Йорк. Вы слышите первую радиопередачу?
Está acompañada de sus pequeños hijos Caroline y John.
The rocket is lifting off the pad. It's lifting beautifully into the sky.
The American hostages have taken off from Tehran's airport. Nejprve si poslechněte stručný přehled zpráv.
A 20-year-old student who was on Tiananmen Square when the troops arrived before dawn told VOA it took him nearly 2 hours to crawl out of the square to avoid getting shot.
This is the Voice of America, continuing now with other events making news.